"Escort the waitress out. She doesn't belong in this room." The words sliced cleanly through the elegant hum of crystal glasses and polite laughter, leaving behind a silence so sudden that even the string quartet seemed to miss a beat. Every head inside the Grand Crescent Ballroom turned toward the young woman standing near the champagne station, a silver serving tray balanced carefully in her hands. Naomi Brooks didn't move. She simply blinked once, her fingers tightening ever so slightly around the polished edge of the tray as dozens of unfamiliar eyes settled on her. The ballroom shimmered beneath towering chandeliers that scattered warm golden light across marble floors imported from Italy, while fresh white orchids framed every table in flawless symmetry. It was the annual Caldwell Children's Hope Gala, one of the most prestigious charity events in New York City, attended by business leaders, philanthropists, celebrities, and elected officials. Invitations were nearly impossible to obtain. Staff members like Naomi entered only through the service corridor, wearing pressed black uniforms designed to make them nearly invisible. Richard Caldwell stood near the center of the ballroom, every inch the commanding host. At 61, his silver hair, tailored tuxedo, and measured posture reflected decades of wealth, discipline, and public admiration. His foundation had funded hospitals, scholarships, and children's shelters across the country. Tonight was supposed to celebrate generosity. Instead, his expression had hardened into quiet disappointment as he looked directly at Naomi. Beside him stood Emily Carter, the event director, clutching a small velvet jewelry box with trembling hands. Moments earlier, one of the guests had realized an antique diamond necklace was no longer inside. The ballroom had erupted into whispers almost instantly. Security had quietly sealed the exits while staff members were instructed to remain where they stood. Naomi had done exactly that. She hadn't protested. She hadn't stepped away. She simply waited, hoping the misunderstanding would disappear as quickly as it had appeared. But then someone quietly pointed in her direction. Another guest remembered seeing her walking near the family lounge where the necklace had last been displayed before the fundraising auction. A third person added that she had briefly disappeared down the west hallway. None of it sounded convincing, yet together the assumptions began forming a story no one bothered to question. Emily lowered her voice. "Mr. Caldwell, perhaps we should ask her to leave before this becomes uncomfortable for our guests." Richard gave one slow nod. "Escort her outside until this is sorted out." His words were calm, almost gentle, but to Naomi they landed heavier than anger ever could. Two security officers approached respectfully. Neither looked hostile. One offered an apologetic smile as he gestured toward the entrance. Naomi slowly set the untouched champagne tray onto a nearby serving table. Her heartbeat echoed inside her ears, but her face remained composed. She looked once across the ballroom, not at the wealthy donors or the reporters quietly raising their phones, but toward the children's play lounge across the hall. Through the partially open doorway, she caught sight of a little girl, no older than 7, sitting alone on a velvet chair with her small hands folded tightly in her lap. The child looked frightened, glancing repeatedly toward the ballroom as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. Naomi's eyes lingered on her for only a second before she quietly spoke, her voice soft enough that only those closest could hear. "Before I leave, would someone please check on the little girl first?" Confused silence answered her. Emily frowned. Richard's brow tightened. One guest let out a puzzled chuckle. Another whispered that she was only trying to delay being escorted away. Naomi offered no explanation. She simply looked toward the child once more, her expression filled not with fear for herself, but with quiet concern for someone else. Then, without another word, she turned toward the grand entrance, following the security officers beneath the towering crystal chandeliers while hundreds of eyes watched her disappear into the cool night beyond the ballroom doors. The cool evening air wrapped around Naomi Brooks the moment the ballroom doors closed behind her. The muffled music faded into the distance, replaced by the gentle rustling of maple trees lining the entrance to the historic hotel. She stood beneath the wide stone canopy, drawing one slow breath after another, letting the crisp October breeze settle the ache rising quietly inside her chest. She did not cry. She had learned years ago that dignity often spoke loudest in silence. One of the security officers paused beside her. "I am sorry, ma'am," he said softly, "We are just following instructions." Naomi answered with the same calm smile she had offered guests all evening. "I understand." There was no bitterness in her voice, only grace. The officer nodded respectfully before returning inside, leaving Naomi alone beneath the glowing lanterns that framed the entrance. She folded her hands together, watching expensive black sedans arrive one after another as elegantly dressed guests continued stepping onto the red carpet, completely unaware that one quiet waitress had just become the center of whispered conversations inside. This job had never been about prestige. 3 nights each week Naomi worked catering events across Manhattan because the extra income helped cover the rent on the small apartment she shared with her grandmother in Queens. Every morning, she prepared breakfast before taking her grandmother to physical therapy twice a week. Between appointments, she volunteered several afternoons each month at the neighborhood library, reading children's books to students whose parents often worked late shifts. She had once dreamed of becoming an elementary school teacher. Life had simply taken a different route. Student loans, medical bills, and unexpected responsibilities had slowly replaced lesson plans and college classrooms. Still, she never allowed disappointment to harden her heart. Her grandmother often reminded her that character was something no paycheck could ever buy. "People will remember how you make them feel," she always said while pouring sweet tea into chipped porcelain cups that had survived nearly 40 years of family dinners. Naomi carried those words everywhere she went. Even during 12-hour catering shifts, she remembered guests' names, noticed when elderly donors needed assistance with stairs, and quietly refilled water glasses before anyone asked. Many people never looked directly at her. Some barely acknowledged she existed. She never let that define who she was. Earlier that evening, before the first guests had arrived, she had been arranging dessert plates near the family lounge when she noticed a little girl sitting alone by the large bay window. The child wore a pale blue dress and shiny black shoes that swung several inches above the carpet because her feet could not yet reach the floor. While adults hurried through final preparations, the girl sat hugging her knees, watching the ballroom fill with strangers. Naomi had knelt beside her for only a moment. "Big parties can feel loud," she had said gently. The little girl had nodded without speaking. Naomi smiled and pointed toward the enormous crystal chandelier overhead. "Whenever I get nervous, I pick one sparkle and keep my eyes on it until I remember to breathe." The child had looked up, following the light, and after a few seconds a tiny smile appeared. It lasted only a moment, but Naomi carried that smile with her through the rest of the evening. Now, standing outside beneath the hotel lights, she found herself thinking about the same little girl. There had been something unusual in the child's expression just before Naomi was escorted away. It was not fear of the missing necklace. It looked more like the heavy silence of a child carrying a secret too big for someone so young. Naomi glanced back once toward the towering ballroom windows glowing against the night sky. She could not explain why, but deep inside she knew the evening was far from over. Inside the Grand Crescent Ballroom, the elegant rhythm of the evening had begun to unravel beneath carefully controlled smiles. Conversations continued, champagne continued to flow, and cameras continued flashing near the stage where the annual scholarship auction would soon begin. But an invisible layer of tension now lingered beneath every polished greeting. Richard Caldwell remained standing exactly where Naomi had left him, his hands folded neatly in front of him while guests quietly pretended not to notice the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the center of the room. For more than 30 years, Richard had built a reputation that newspapers admired and competitors respected. He had transformed a modest family construction company into one of the largest commercial development firms on the East Coast. His name appeared on hospitals, university buildings, museums, and children's centers across the country. Every public appearance reflected careful preparation. Every speech was measured. Every decision reinforced one principle above all else. Order created trust. Trust built legacy. Mistakes, even small ones, threatened everything he had spent a lifetime protecting. That belief shaped every part of his life, including tonight's gala. Richard slowly adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo while Emily Carter stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The donors are asking questions," she whispered. "They are concerned about the necklace." Richard answered without looking at her. "The evening continues exactly as planned." Emily nodded immediately. She had worked alongside Richard for nearly 8 years and understood that once he made a decision, changing his mind was almost impossible. His confidence often reassured investors during uncertain markets, but outside the boardroom, that same confidence sometimes became something else. He trusted first impressions almost as much as evidence. Across the ballroom, Daniel Hayes observed the room quietly from beside the silent auction display. As chief executive officer of Hayes Financial Group, he had attended countless charity events over the years, and experience had taught him that moments of panic often revealed more about people than moments of celebration. His attention drifted toward the family lounge where several parents now gathered around the children while staff attempted to calm growing uncertainty. Something about the evening felt incomplete. He replayed Naomi's final words in his mind. She had not defended herself. She had not argued. She had not accused anyone else. Instead, she had asked only one simple question. Please, check on the little girl first. Daniel frowned slightly. It was an unusual response for someone facing public embarrassment. Most innocent people immediately tried proving they were innocent. Naomi had seemed far more concerned about the child than about herself. Meanwhile, Richard accepted another greeting from a senator seated near the front tables, smiling politely while photographers captured the exchange. Outwardly, he appeared composed, but a quiet restlessness had begun settling inside him. He could still picture Naomi's expression when security approached. There had been disappointment, certainly, yet no anger. Even more unusual was the calm certainty in her eyes when she mentioned the little girl. It was not the look of someone inventing a distraction. It was the look of someone trying to protect something fragile. Emily returned moments later carrying the empty velvet jewelry box. We have searched the preparation rooms, the kitchen, and every service station, she reported. Nothing. Richard nodded once. Continue. Before Emily could walk away, a faint sound interrupted the orchestra. It was not loud enough for most guests to notice. Just a quiet sob drifting from the hallway leading toward the family lounge. Daniel turned immediately. So did Richard. Through the partially open doorway, they saw the same little girl Naomi had noticed earlier, sitting exactly where she had been before. Her shoulders trembled gently as she stared down at her small hands, refusing to look at any of the worried adults kneeling beside her. Then Richard noticed something he had completely overlooked before. Clutched tightly against the child's blue dress was a small white cardigan, held so close to her chest that it almost looked as though she was hiding it from everyone around her. For the first time that evening, Richard Caldwell felt something unfamiliar replace certainty. It was doubt. Daniel Hayes crossed the ballroom without waiting for anyone to invite him. The polished marble floor reflected the warm chandelier light beneath his careful steps as conversations gradually faded behind him. Parents standing near the family lounge instinctively stepped aside when they recognized him. He knelt several feet away from the little girl instead of crowding her, keeping his voice calm and gentle. "Hello there," he said with a reassuring smile. "My name is Daniel. May I sit with you for a minute?" The child gave the smallest nod without lifting her eyes. Richard Caldwell arrived only moments later, followed by Emily Carter and 2 members of the hotel security team. Nobody spoke. Even the orchestra seemed quieter now, as though the room itself had begun holding its breath. Daniel noticed the white cardigan pressed tightly against the little girl's chest. "That is a beautiful sweater," he said softly. "Is it yours?" The girl hesitated before answering. "No, sir." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "It belongs to my mommy." Daniel smiled kindly. "Would you mind showing it to me?" Tiny fingers slowly loosened their grip. As she unfolded the cardigan, something heavy slipped from one of the deep front pockets and landed gently against the velvet carpet with a clear metallic sound. Every eye dropped at once. Resting beneath the golden light was the missing diamond necklace. Nobody moved. Emily covered her mouth with both hands. One security officer inhaled sharply. Richard stared at the necklace as though his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The little girl's frightened face turned pale. "I am sorry," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I thought it was pretty. I found it on the chair after Mommy took off her sweater because she said it was too warm. I wanted to keep it safe so nobody would step on it." Then everybody started talking about someone stealing it. Her lower lip trembled. "I got scared." Daniel carefully picked up the necklace with both hands before placing it back inside the velvet jewelry box Emily still carried. "You did not steal anything," he said warmly. "You were trying to protect it." The little girl looked confused. I was. Daniel nodded. Yes. Next time, tell an adult right away. But tonight, you were only trying to help. Relief slowly replaced fear across the child's face as her mother rushed forward, wrapping her in a gentle embrace. Several nearby guests quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Richard remained perfectly still. Every word Naomi had spoken replayed inside his mind with painful clarity. Please check on the little girl first. She had known. Somehow, in the middle of accusations directed toward herself, she had recognized exactly what had happened. She could have defended her own reputation. She could have argued with security or demanded to be heard. Instead, she had chosen to protect a frightened child from public embarrassment, even if it meant allowing suspicion to follow her out the front door. Richard lowered his head for a long moment. His reflection shimmered faintly in the polished marble beneath him. Decades of business success had taught him to read contracts, evaluate risks, and judge character within seconds. Tonight, every one of those instincts had failed him. Emily looked toward the entrance with growing regret. Mr. Caldwell, she said quietly. She never once tried to save herself. Richard finally looked up. The confidence that had guided him all evening had disappeared, replaced by something far heavier. Without saying another word, he removed the event badge clipped inside his tuxedo jacket and handed it to Emily. You are in charge until I return. Emily blinked. Where are you going? Richard's answer came without hesitation. To find the woman who deserved better than the way we treated her. Then, before another guest could speak, he turned and walked swiftly toward the towering front doors, his pace quickening with every step until he was no longer walking at all. The revolving doors swept open as Richard Caldwell stepped into the cool Manhattan night, the sharp autumn air meeting him with a chill that seemed far more honest than the warmth he had left behind. The glow from the ballroom spilled across the front steps, stretching long golden reflections over the polished stone, but Naomi Brooks was nowhere to be seen. Valets paused in the middle of parking luxury sedans. Hotel attendants exchanged puzzled glances as they watched one of the city's most recognizable philanthropists scanning the sidewalk instead of greeting arriving guests. Richard descended the wide staircase 2 steps at a time, his polished shoes striking the granite with an urgency no one had witnessed from him in years. Did anyone see the waitress who just left? He asked the nearest doorman. The older man removed his cap respectfully. Yes, sir. She thanked the security officers, then walked toward Lexington Avenue. She did not seem upset. Richard looked down the nearly empty street, where yellow taxi cabs drifted through the evening traffic beneath rows of glowing streetlights. He could have returned inside. He could have instructed an assistant to locate her tomorrow. Instead, something deep within him refused to wait another minute. Across the street, Naomi sat alone on a wooden bench beneath a line of amber-colored maple trees. She had removed the small catering name tag from her uniform and held it quietly between her fingers, tracing the engraved letters without really looking at them. Around her, the city continued moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. A couple laughed while walking their dog. A cyclist rolled past with a delivery bag strapped across his back. Somewhere in the distance, a subway train rumbled beneath the streets. Naomi watched the steady flow of ordinary life and allowed herself one slow breath. She was disappointed, but not defeated. She had experienced unfair judgment before. What hurt was not losing a shift. It was knowing that kindness had once again been mistaken for weakness. Her thoughts drifted toward the little girl inside the ballroom. She hoped the child had found the courage to tell the truth. That hope mattered more to her than clearing her own name. As she looked down at the name tag resting in her palm, footsteps echoed across the sidewalk behind her. At first they were distant, then quicker, then almost hurried. She assumed it was another pedestrian until a familiar voice, slightly out of breath, called gently through the evening air. Miss Brooks. Naomi turned. Richard Caldwell stood several yards away, his tuxedo slightly unbuttoned, his breathing uneven from crossing the block faster than he had in many years. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The sounds of traffic softened into the background while cool wind stirred the fallen leaves around the bench. Richard took one careful step closer. His expression no longer carried the certainty that had defined him throughout the evening. Instead, there was humility, quiet and unmistakable. The necklace has been found, he said softly. Naomi simply nodded. I thought it would be. Richard searched her face, almost expecting satisfaction or vindication, but found neither. You knew the little girl had it, he said. Naomi looked toward the hotel entrance where the ballroom lights shimmered against the night sky. I saw her pick it up after it slipped from her mother's sweater pocket. She looked frightened when everyone started searching. I was afraid that if people questioned her in front of hundreds of strangers, she would remember that moment for the rest of her life. Richard lowered his eyes. Every word settled heavily inside him because it revealed the truth he had completely overlooked. While everyone else had been trying to protect a priceless necklace or an important reputation, Naomi had been protecting the heart of a frightened child. The realization struck him with greater force than any public criticism ever could. For the first time in decades, Richard Caldwell understood that the greatest mistake of the evening had never been a missing piece of jewelry. It had been the way he judged the character of the person standing quietly in front of him. Richard remained standing in front of Naomi as the evening breeze carried a swirl of amber leaves across the sidewalk between them. For a man who had negotiated billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, finding the next sentence felt unexpectedly difficult. The city moved around them with its usual restless rhythm. Traffic lights shifted from red to green. Taxi horns echoed somewhere down Lexington Avenue. A street musician several blocks away played a slow melody on a saxophone that drifted softly through the cool October air. Yet for those few quiet moments, everything else seemed impossibly far away. Naomi rose from the wooden bench, slipping her small name tag into the pocket of her neatly pressed black apron. She stood with the same quiet dignity she had carried inside the ballroom. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, only a calm that came from knowing she had acted according to her conscience. Richard looked at her for a long moment before finally speaking. I judged you before I knew the truth. His voice was lower than before, stripped of the confidence that usually filled boardrooms and press conferences. I believed assumptions because they fit the story unfolding in front of me. I never stopped to ask what you had actually seen. Naomi listened without interrupting. She understood that some apologies arrived quickly, while others required courage simply to begin. Richard continued, almost speaking more to himself than to her. For years I convinced myself that experience allowed me to read people accurately. Tonight proved how wrong that belief can become. Naomi glanced toward the hotel across the street, where the ballroom windows glowed like rows of golden lanterns against the dark skyline. Sometimes, she said gently, the first thing we notice is not always the most important thing. Richard followed her gaze. Through the enormous glass windows, he could still see elegantly dressed guests gathering near the stage, their conversations gradually returning as the evening recovered from its interruption. The gala would continue. The auction would raise millions of dollars for children. Tomorrow's newspapers would probably praise another successful charitable event. Yet Richard understood that none of those accomplishments could erase what had already happened. Reputation could be repaired with public relations. Character required something far more personal. Naomi rested one hand lightly on the back of the bench as another cool breeze swept through the trees overhead. My grandmother used to tell me that fear makes good people forget to be kind, she said with a small smile. She also said that when fear leaves, kindness has another chance to return. Richard absorbed every word in silence. He found himself wondering how many opportunities he had missed throughout his life because he had valued certainty more than compassion. Numbers had always been easy. Balance sheets either matched or they did not. Buildings either stood or they fell. Human hearts were different. They carried stories invisible to anyone unwilling to slow down long enough to notice them. A few yards away, the hotel doorman watched quietly from beneath the entrance canopy. Even he seemed to recognize that something important was unfolding, though no raised voices or dramatic gestures marked the moment. There was only conversation carried by honesty and humility beneath the soft glow of the streetlights. Richard drew one careful breath before meeting Naomi's eyes again. You protected a frightened little girl even after everyone believed the worst about you. Naomi answered almost immediately. She was only a child. And you were standing alone, Richard replied. Naomi gave a gentle shrug. Children remember moments like that for the rest of their lives. Adults have more chances to heal. Richard felt those words settle deeply inside him. He had spent decades funding schools, hospitals, and scholarship programs, believing generosity was measured by checks signed and buildings dedicated. Standing on that quiet sidewalk beside the woman he had wrongly judged, he realized that sometimes the greatest act of generosity was protecting another person's dignity when no one else thought it mattered. Neither of them spoke again for several seconds. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest, like the first calm breath after a storm had finally passed. Richard slowly reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and removed a folded white handkerchief embroidered with the initials RC. He looked at it for a brief moment before offering it to Naomi, almost instinctively, as the cool breeze swept another wave of golden leaves across the sidewalk. She smiled softly but shook her head. "Thank you. I am all right." Richard quietly returned it to his pocket, realizing she did not need comfort nearly as much as he needed forgiveness. Across the street, the towering ballroom windows reflected the moving headlights of passing cars, their warm glow contrasting with the cool blue evening settling over Manhattan. Behind those windows, hundreds of guests continued celebrating. Generosity, without realizing the evening's greatest lesson, had taken place outside their view. Richard took another slow breath. "Miss Brooks, would you allow me the opportunity to correct what I did?" Naomi looked at him with calm curiosity. "How?" "Please come back inside." She remained silent. Richard continued before she could answer. "Not as a waitress." The word surprised even him. "As my honored guest." Naomi blinked once, uncertain she had heard correctly. Richard's voice carried no trace of authority now, only sincerity. "Every person inside that ballroom watched you leave believing something about your character that was never true. I cannot change what happened, but I can make certain they learn the truth from me." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, considering his request. "Mr. Caldwell," she said gently, "the truth is already enough for me. I do not need everyone to know I was innocent." Richard shook his head slowly. "Perhaps you do not, but they do." The answer lingered between them. "If they leave tonight believing appearances matter more than integrity, then I have failed as the host of an event meant to celebrate compassion." Naomi studied his face carefully. She saw no desire to protect his reputation. She saw a man confronting the weight of his own mistake. Before either of them spoke again, the hotel's front doors opened once more. Daniel Hayes stepped outside, carrying Naomi's neatly folded black catering blazer over one arm. He walked toward them with an easy smile. "I thought you might need this," he said, handing it to her. "Thank you," Naomi replied warmly. Daniel glanced at Richard before looking back at Naomi. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I have spent more than 25 years hiring executives, managers, analysts, and advisors. Every interview begins with impressive resumes. Every recommendation lists accomplishments. But tonight, I watched something far more valuable than any qualification." Naomi looked slightly puzzled. Daniel smiled. "You chose someone else's dignity over your own reputation. That is not a skill people learn in business school." Richard quietly nodded in agreement. Daniel continued, "The children hour. Companies support do not only need scholarships. They need adults who understand compassion the way you do." Naomi looked away for a moment as passing headlights reflected softly across the sidewalk. Her grandmother's voice echoed gently in her memory. "Character is what you do when nobody is planning to applaud." She almost smiled. Richard finally spoke again, his voice steady but humble. "Miss Brooks, tonight I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. We spend enormous amounts of money teaching leadership, yet somehow we forget to teach kindness." Naomi answered with quiet honesty. "Kindness cannot be taught in a seminar. People usually learn it after they have needed it themselves." Neither Richard nor Daniel responded immediately because neither man could find a better truth than the one she had just spoken. The city seemed strangely peaceful as another gentle breeze moved through the trees overhead. Somewhere behind them, the ballroom orchestra began playing again, the soft notes drifting out through the opening doors. Richard looked toward the music, then back at Naomi. This time, when he extended his hand toward the entrance, it was not an invitation from a wealthy host to a member of his staff. It was one human being asking another for the chance to make things right. Naomi looked at Richard's outstretched hand for several quiet seconds before offering a gentle smile that carried neither pride nor resentment. Then she gave a small nod. "If we go back," she said softly, "it cannot be so people feel sorry for me. It has to be so that little girl understands she did nothing wrong." Richard's eyes reflected genuine respect. That is exactly why we are going back. Together they crossed the street beneath the glow of the hotel lights, their footsteps steady against the polished stone walkway. Daniel Hayes followed a few steps behind, watching in silence as the distance between misunderstanding and reconciliation slowly disappeared with every step. The revolving doors turned once more, and conversations inside the ballroom gradually faded as guests noticed Richard returning much sooner than expected. What surprised them even more was the woman walking beside him. The same waitress who had quietly left under suspicion only minutes earlier now entered through the front doors at the host's side. The orchestra slowed until the final note gently dissolved into silence. Hundreds of eyes followed them as Richard guided Naomi toward the center of the ballroom where the evening had first unraveled. Emily Carter looked visibly relieved the moment she saw them. Nearby, the little girl who had unknowingly carried the necklace peeked out from behind her mother's shoulder. Naomi smiled warmly at her, and the child answered with a shy smile of her own, the fear that had clouded her face now completely gone. Richard stepped onto the small stage where he had planned to deliver his closing remarks later that evening. Instead of beginning with fundraising numbers or scholarship announcements, he rested both hands lightly against the podium and looked across the crowded ballroom. The room became perfectly still. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but unmistakably sincere. "Before this evening continues, I owe someone an apology." A ripple of quiet surprise spread across the room. Richard turned toward Naomi. "Earlier tonight, I made a decision based on assumption instead of truth. I allowed appearances to outweigh character, and in doing so I treated an innocent woman with unfair judgment." No camera flashes interrupted him now. No whispered conversations distracted the room. Every guest listened. Richard continued. "The missing necklace was never stolen. It was accidentally placed inside a child's sweater pocket by someone trying to protect it. Miss Naomi Brooks recognized what had happened almost immediately. Yet instead of defending herself, she chose to protect a frightened little girl from public embarrassment." Several guests slowly lowered their eyes. Others exchanged quiet glances of regret as they remembered the conclusions they had reached only minutes earlier. Richard looked toward Naomi once again. "She reminded me tonight that kindness requires courage, especially when no one is offering it in return." Naomi stepped onto the stage only after Richard motioned gently for her to join him. She stood comfortably beside the podium, never seeking attention, never asking for recognition. Richard offered her the microphone. She accepted it politely and looked around the ballroom, her expression as calm as ever. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But I hope nobody leaves tonight feeling ashamed. We all make quick decisions sometimes. What matters is what we choose after we learn the truth." Her eyes drifted toward the little girl. Children watch how adults respond when mistakes happen. If they see forgiveness, they learn forgiveness. If they see grace, they learn grace. The little girl smiled through bright eyes before giving Naomi a tiny wave. Naomi returned the gesture with a gentle smile that needed no further words. For a brief moment, nobody applauded. The silence itself felt too meaningful to interrupt. Then one guest slowly rose to his feet. Another followed. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom stood together, not because they had witnessed someone famous or powerful, but because they had witnessed quiet integrity refusing to surrender to humiliation. The applause filled the grand hall, echoing beneath the crystal chandeliers, while Richard Caldwell remained standing beside Naomi, grateful that the greatest lesson of the evening had come from the one person everyone had almost failed to see. The applause lingered beneath the crystal chandeliers long after the last pair of hands had stopped clapping, leaving behind a silence unlike the one that had filled the ballroom earlier that evening. This silence carried no suspicion. It carried understanding. Guests slowly returned to their seats with quieter voices and gentler expressions, as though each person had left behind something invisible they no longer wished to carry. Richard Caldwell remained beside Naomi for another moment before turning toward the audience one final time. "Tonight," he said softly, "our foundation came together to invest in the future of children. But I believe we have all been reminded that the greatest gift we can offer the next generation is not money alone. It is the example we choose to set." No one interrupted him. There was nothing left to add. "Emily." Carter approached Naomi with folded hands and warm eyes. I owe you an apology as well, she said. I should have asked questions before making assumptions. Naomi smiled gently. Thank you. That means more than you know. Nearby, the little girl carefully walked across the ballroom holding her mother's hand. When she reached Naomi, she looked up with shy eyes and wrapped both small arms around her waist. Thank you for not being mad at me, she whispered. Naomi knelt so they were eye to eye. There was never a reason to be mad at you, she answered. You tried to protect something important. Next time, just remember that asking for help is another way of being brave. The little girl nodded with a bright smile before slipping her tiny hand back into her mother's. Several guests quietly wiped away tears while watching the simple exchange. Daniel Hayes stood near the stage, observing everything with thoughtful eyes. Before leaving for the evening, he walked over to Naomi and handed her a business card. If you ever decide that teaching children is still your dream, he said, call me. My company funds educational programs throughout New York. I believe those students would be fortunate to learn from someone who teaches kindness long before lessons begin. Naomi accepted the card with quiet gratitude, not because it promised opportunity, but because someone had finally seen the person she had always tried to be. Later that night, after the final guests had departed and the ballroom lights began dimming one row at a time, Richard remained alone near the center of the empty hall. Workers quietly folded white tablecloths while florists gathered the last orchids into wooden crates. The marble floor that had reflected glittering gowns only hours earlier now reflected little more than warm pools of fading light. Richard noticed something resting on one of the nearby chairs. It was Naomi's catering name tag. Somehow it had slipped from her apron pocket after she changed into her coat. He picked it up carefully, brushing away an almost invisible speck of dust with his thumb. For several long seconds, he simply stared at the engraved letters. Naomi Brooks. Such a small piece of metal, yet it reminded him how easily society attached labels to people before learning their stories. Instead of placing it into the lost and found box, Richard slipped it gently into the inside pocket of his jacket beside the embroidered handkerchief he had carried all evening. It would remain there as a quiet reminder that dignity should never depend upon a job title, a uniform, or the color of someone's skin. Outside, Naomi stepped onto the sidewalk beneath a clear autumn sky where the first stars had begun appearing above the city skyline. She paused only once before walking toward the subway entrance, breathing in the cool night air with peaceful confidence. Behind her, the Grand Hotel still glowed with elegance, but its brightest light no longer came from the crystal chandeliers inside. It lived instead in the hearts of those who had learned that true greatness is never measured by wealth or status, but by the courage to choose compassion when judgment would have been easier. And as the quiet wind carried another shower of golden leaves across the empty sidewalk, the city seemed to whisper the only ending that truly mattered. Kindness had not been mistaken for weakness after all. It had quietly become the strongest voice in the room.